Russia's economy has always felt like it's on a roller coaster. Long periods of decline are followed by periods of growth, then up and down, until nobody really knows what's going on. But now a true collapse is coming, as Russia is stumbling along like a wheezing old man struggling for breath. Any one of those breaths could be the last. Vladimir Putin's humiliation is complete, as Russia has been embarrassed on the global stage. Ukraine just pulled off the impossible, and Russia's economy is feeling the effects. We'll start with the major headline. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine is set to outgrow Russia economically over the course of an entire year. That revelation comes from Euromaidan Press, which reported on the International Monetary Fund's, or IMF's, World Economic Outlook. Published in January, that document provides the gross domestic product, or GDP, forecasts for nations across the entire world in 2026. Some of the usual suspects sit at the top of the list. India's GDP is expected to grow by 6.2% this year, and China will enjoy growth of 4.5%, if the IMF is correct. But the real news comes from Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's GDP is expected to grow by 2%, Russia's by just 0.8%. That's a 1.2% difference that is much larger than it sounds. Ukraine has pulled off what should be impossible by outpacing Russia's economy at a time when the entire country is being battered by the war that Putin started. That shouldn't be happening. As for Russia, it now sits rock bottom on the list of the world's major economies, with India, China, the US, and even the struggling Eurozone being comfortably above it. As all of these economies, along with Ukraine, post encouraging figures, Russia is slipping closer to stagnation, and from there may lie utter oblivion. All of the signs are showing us that Russia's economic foundation is crumbling from underneath it, and those signs will be revealed later in the video. As for Ukraine, the news that it's outpacing Russia is welcome but bittersweet. The reason is explained by the Combat Veteran News YouTube channel. Now, to be clear, if you're an emerging economy like Ukraine, and that's a middle-income economy, well, 2% is actually pretty rough. You generally want to see those economies when they are, well, at peace, and with robust, larger trading partners, you generally see from them growing 4, 5, sometimes even 6% a year, the channel says. Indeed, Focus Economics' December 2025 list of the world's fastest growing economies shows us the likes of Guyana achieving 22.4% growth on the back of an oil bonanza, and Ethiopia growing by 7.3%, due in part to support from major partners like the IMF and the World Bank. Ukraine has both resources and international backing, albeit of a different kind, so it could feasibly experience growth somewhat like that. Still, the fact that its economy is growing at all, as Russia launches almost daily airstrikes while up to 700,000 of the country's soldiers are trying to invade, speaks wonders for Ukraine's resilience. The war that Putin started is turning out to be the making of a great nation. It's also veering ever closer to destroying a once great country. The story here isn't about what the perfect world would have delivered to Ukraine if Putin had never made his insane decision to invade. It's about what the invasion has done to Russia. In its report on the IMF forecast, the Moscow Times reveals that things are even worse for Russia than they first appear. The 0.8% prediction actually represents the IMF slashing its forecasts by 0.2%. The same outlet notes that the news coming out of Russia's central bank, which has, shall we say, a vested interest in massaging the country's growth figures, has projected GDP growth at somewhere between 0.5% and 1.5%. The latter figure seems ambitious, with the former being far more likely. Remember that these figures are for 2026. The IMF's forecast for Russia's 2025 is currently 0.6%, which means 2026 will be the second year of stagnation for Russia's economy. What we're seeing now tells us that stagnation may end up evolving into financial collapse. The signs are all there, and none of the issues about which you're going to learn are going to get any better as Putin continues an invasion that has already cost his country so much. Starting with the basics, it almost goes without saying that Russia's war chest is running dangerously low due to the strain that the Ukraine war has placed on the country's economy. That was made clear by economist Volodymyr Vlasyuk back in October when he told Euromaidan Press that Russia maybe had between 12 and 18 months of war funding left before the money would run out. At the time, Russia's budget deficit had quadrupled as its oil revenues had declined to the point where they accounted for barely a fifth of the federal budget. Typically, revenues from Russia's oil and gas industry account for between 30 and 50% of that budget, as well as 20% of the country's entire GDP, per the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Over $100 billion had also been pulled from Russia's National Wealth Fund by October. What essentially amounts to a rainy day fund that exists to pull Russia through emergencies has been pulling its weight for Putin during the crisis he has created for his country. By October, A $145 billion fund had been reduced to $40 billion. These were all early hints that the IMF projections suggested are far more damaging to Russia than Putin wants people to believe. Now let's get into the real meat of what's happening to Russia's economy. We've already touched on oil, but a vague mention of revenue slipping doesn't tell the full story. Euromaidan Press points out that the IMF forecast landed on the exact same day that Reuters revealed that Russia's oil and gas revenue was due to drop by an enormous 46% in January when compared to the same month in 2025. Russia will still make billions from its oil, about $5.41 billion in fact. However, even that figure is the lowest that Russia has seen since August 2020. The COVID pandemic was crippling demand for fuel across the world at that point. So it looks like Russia is slipping back to levels that only a worldwide virus had caused in the recent past. That's a strangely impressive collapse in a twisted kind of way. It's not as though Russia had enjoyed a banner year for oil and gas revenue in 2025 that could have softened this blow either. Seeing a decline like the one anticipated in January is one thing coming off the back of strong sales. Having that decline happen in the first month of a new year that follows on from a year that broke records for its oil and gas declines is quite another. As Bloomberg reported on January 15th, Russia's oil and gas revenue dropped by 24% in 2025 when compared to 2024, again delivering a low point that hasn't been seen in 5 years. That puts Russia right back down to the COVID era again, only for an entire year. Perhaps Putin is pining for a time when millions of Russians were wearing masks instead of dying or getting injured in Ukraine. A consistent downward trend is pretty evident at this point. But what may end up taking Russia's oil and gas issues from crisis into catastrophe is that there is no light on the horizon. Compounding all of these issues are lower prices on Urals crude when compared to Brent crude oil, Russia's main dollars. According to Medusa, the fund's liquid assets are now around $53.4 billion. Hey, that's at least one sign of growth, right? Sure. However, the fund has still shrunk to the point where it's no longer large enough to cover Russia's national deficit. In fact, Medusa claims that Putin's consistent reliance on this fund has widened the budget deficit in addition to fueling inflation. All of this means that Russia's central bank can't cut interest rates as much as it would like, and while those rates are high, Russia's businesses are struggling to pay back their loans. Remember that point, it's going to be important later. In a desperate attempt to make up the shortfall in taxable oil and gas revenue, the Kremlin has made the decision to raise Russia's value-added tax, or VAT, rate from 20% to 22%. That hike has been accompanied by the lowering of thresholds, thus pulling more struggling small businesses into the VAT band, and an increase in corporate tax that will also feel like a haymaker to the collective face of Russian industry. With these measures, the Kremlin hopes to generate an additional $21.8 billion in revenue. But that doesn't even cover half of Russia's projected federal budget deficit, Euromaidan Press reports. We guess a half measure would be hard-pressed to deliver more than half. Of course, this tax increase is ultimately trickling back down to everyday Russian citizens. Businesses have already started hiking their prices, out of necessity perhaps more than desire, to account for the extra tax they'll be paying. These increases are massive, as the Moscow Times reported on January 20th. Prices in food service, fitness, private healthcare and education rose by an average 8 to 10%, while IT and digital services increased prices by 5 to 7%, the outlet says. Remember that these are price increases levied on a population that is already dealing with high inflation and interest rates that make getting loans difficult. Teeth meet kick. Putin won't care though, as he has shown himself to place little value on the life of the average Russian during a war that has cost Russia almost 1.23 million casualties in less than 4 years. But what Putin may care about is that the doldrums into which he has pulled Russian industry are leading many of the country's businesses to the brink of bankruptcy. The YouTuber Anna Danilchuk, who is an associate professor at Ukraine's fakeUkraina Volyn National University, highlights this problem in a January 17th video. The number of companies that went through default in 2025 was twice as big as even in 2022, which is a very negative number, she says, adding, "And small businesses, middle businesses, they will literally disappear because of the increased VAT and the fact that many Russians who previously did not pay will be made to do it because the threshold was lowered. And those bankruptcies are coming." It's not just the new VAT rate that's the problem either. In November, the Moscow Times reported that companies in Russia face a record debt burden as a result of several years of dealing with enormous interest rates. Debt servicing was swallowing up 39% of the average company's pre-tax and pre-interest profits by September of 2025. These aren't figures derived from a Western source either. The outlet says that the figures came from the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, which is an organization that has direct links to the Kremlin. That share of debt servicing has also tripled over the last 2 years up to September 2025, and it rose by 1.5 times during the first 9 months of that year. The burden from interest payments on corporate income is at an extremely high level, the centre said in a fairly stoic assessment of the situation. But then, screaming about the collapse of Russian industry through the halls of the Kremlin isn't really an option when there are so many open windows around. More borrowers, both full businesses and individual entrepreneurs, were also overdue on their payments by November 2025. The figure stood at 24.1% at the start of October, which itself is an increase over the 17.9% of overdue borrowers seen at the beginning of the year. It's starting to seem like if there's a bad economic metric to be had, Russia is in the fast lane to grab it. And naturally, these debt burdens are leading to companies struggling all across Russia. On January 21st, Charter 97 reported that over 7,000 of Russia's trucking companies are now teetering on the edge of bankruptcy as gasoline prices rocket up and debt becomes unmanageable. We can't overemphasize how big of a problem this is for Russia. This is a country that relies so heavily on rail for its transport and logistics that it led the International Center for Defense and Security to dub Russia's rail network the Iron Leviathan. If you're wondering what trucking has to do with rail, ask yourself how cargo gets transported to trains. How does it get moved from trains to the places inside Russia that it needs to go? This is the work done by the trucks, so 7,000 trucking companies going bankrupt would shatter Russia's wartime logistics. Oh, and by the way, Russian Railways, which is Russia's main rail company, is creaking under the weight of a $51 billion debt of its own, according to a Reuters article shared by investing.com. It seems that no matter where you look in Russian industry, these problems exist. And it gets so much worse than we've already told you, as there's a certain segment of Russian society that is being forced to absorb all of these shots to their bank accounts. And they have far more influence than the average Russians upon whom Putin is leaning to prop up his war. Before we get to them, bankruptcy is also staring entire Russian regions in the face. When Putin pulls from the public purse to fund soldiers and weapons, he does so knowing that the money has to dry up eventually. Regional reserves were running dry back in October, which is when the Moscow Times reported that at least 6 of Russia's regions had been left with about 2 or 3 days' worth of money to spend as of September 1st, 2025. All told, a total of 67 of Russia's regions had ended the first half of 2025 in the red, which tells you all that you need to know about the impact of Putin's war on the public. In Arkhangelsk, just $620,000 of a $1.93 billion annual budget remained. Volgograd had $1.24 million of its $2.43 billion budget remaining, and on it went as several of these regions were left to brave the early months of the winter with almost nothing left. The Kremlin wouldn't feel any of this, of course. But the people who live in those regions, they would see emergency services barely operating, perhaps mass layoffs from government positions and notable decreases in educational spending. Anything that requires money from the public purse would suffer, which means the people who benefit from a region's public spending, i.e. all of them, would suffer too. The situation for many of these regions isn't getting better in 2026. On January 11th, RBC Ukraine reported that the Astrakhan region expects to see a 2.1% decline in its gross regional product. Other Russian regions, such as Belgorod and Kursk, have become frontline territories. 2 oblasts that once traded with Ukraine now have to rely on government subsidies from a federal budget that is getting thinner every year. Across all of Russia, the outlet says, gross regional product is expected to decline by 4.1%, leaving a budget gap of over $570 million. Everywhere you look, Russia is in financial peril. And all of these economic issues are affecting a certain group of people that Putin would do well not to anger. They are the moneymakers and the movers and shakers of Russian industry, even if they've been placed in these positions by Putin himself. They are, of course, the oligarchs. Danilchuk makes a strong point in her video when she says, "Do you think that owners or CEOs of Gazprom or Rosneft are happy to read about more sanctions, to read about more tankers seized, to read about more restrictions for Russia's exports when Russia is fully dependent on the selling of its resources? Of course they aren't. There will inevitably be a wellspring of discontent forming among the oligarchs, though whether they will actually do anything about Russia's problems in the sense of trying to dispose of Putin is another question entirely. If nothing else, Putin has done a good job of stripping the Russian oligarchs of their voices and independence, the BBC said in a December 28th report. Those who criticize Putin's policies face the nationalization of their businesses, as was the case with former banker Oleg Tinkov. The BBC reports him as saying, "I couldn't discuss the price. It was like a hostage. You take what you're offered. I couldn't negotiate." When the Kremlin came calling with a forced offer of nationalization after he described the Ukraine war as crazy on Instagram. So no, it doesn't seem like the oligarchs are going to rise up. But if the Kremlin is taking control of businesses whenever anybody speaks out, it may be shooting itself in the foot anyway. Those who stay silent are watching as their companies crumble. Those businesses are essential to Russia because of the products they create and the people they employ. Forced nationalization is hardly a solution to the uppity oligarch problem either. With Putin so heavily invested in the war, the businesses that the Kremlin essentially steals aren't going to be turned around anytime soon. Even if those nationalized companies suddenly become exempt from repaying their loans, that still impacts the Russian banking system. It's economic pain all over. And there Ukraine stands, watching as the Russian economy falls to its knees, while Ukraine has done something that nobody thought would be possible when the war still raged. Who knows, perhaps even a few oligarchs who are sick of Putin's carrot-and-stick approach could be plotting silently in the shadows as we speak. The collapse may even come as soon as this winter, not just because of Russia's ailing economy, but due to Putin losing international lifelines as Russia plunges into a financial crisis. To find out more, check out our video that discusses how what's coming for Russia may be irreversible. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to The Military Show so we can keep bringing you more updates about the state of Ukraine and Russia's wartime economies. And thank you, as always, for watching.